Hey, it's Professor Gould, and in this lecture, we're going to start talking about some evolutionary mechanisms besides natural selection. But to do that, we need to start talking about what exactly is a species, and it turns out that that's actually kind of a hard question to answer. So the definition that's most common and that we are going to be using is called the biological species concept. And it says that a species is a group of organisms that can successfully interbreed and produce fertile offspring. And that is maintained by reproductive barriers between different species. So essentially, your two individuals are the same species if they can interbreed and produce fertile offspring and can't interbreed and produce fertile offspring with a different group. So what this sounds really simple, right? There are, of course, some problems with it. One, it doesn't apply well at the individual level because, of course, an individual could be sterile, whereas the organism is not an organism as a whole. So it applies to groups of organisms. And also, it does not take into account asexually reproducing organisms. So there are lots of different ways that we could separate different species, including physical separation. And if you think about bacteria, that could mean that bacteria in two different petri dishes were separate species because they can't touch each other. But that doesn't make sense. But also, if you reproduce asexually, then by definition, you have reproductive barriers because you don't interbreed. So see, it does not work for bacteria. So bacteria, archaea, protists that reproduce asexually, it's just not a very helpful definition. So it works well for sexually reproducing organisms. For the bacteria and archaea, you'll have to discuss that with the microbiologists who are currently figuring out, based on genetic technology, how to define a species. Okay, I'm going to leave that to them. All right, so when does something become a species? And it turns out that that's also really, really hard to pinpoint because evolution is very, very slow. So species spend a lot of time diverging, but not being completely reproductively isolated. And so we don't say that speciation is a moment in time, it's a process where you go from one original species to two separate species. So, for example, horses and donkeys are completely separate species. They've been separated for several million years because they can hybridize and produce offspring, but that offspring is infertile. So if you take a female horse and a male donkey, you get a mule, which is an awesome animal. It's an incredible animal. They're very strong. They're very sure-footed because they can see all 4 feet at the same time. So they are very, very good for hauling things in mountains. And so that's why pack mules are really popular in places like the Sierra Nevada. But mules themselves are sterile. The only way you get a mule is by breeding a horse and a donkey. So that means that horses and donkeys are completely separate species. Now, dogs and wolves are considered separate species because they're so very different behaviorally. Because wolves are an entirely wild animal. Dogs are a completely domesticated animal. They are not the same thing anymore, but they're not completely separate species according to that biological species concept, because you can hybridize dogs and wolves. So if you take a wolf like this and it breeds with a dog like this, if this is a Polish Spaniel, you get something like this, which honestly, how adorable is that? It's so cute. Anyway, so They are considered separate species, even though they don't quite meet that biological species concept definition. But behaviorally, they're so different. So yes, we have our definition, but it's not like perfect. Now, also, wolves and dogs have only been being domesticated for, I don't know, tens of thousands of years. Horses and donkeys were separated by millions of years. So evolution is really, really slow. Okay? Except when it's not. Hang on a second. All right. There are two ways that speciation can happen physically. One is called sympatric speciation, which is where it happens within a single population. Now, some people say that this doesn't happen in animals because animals are always free to move around. So there must be something else that creates the separation. This is an ongoing argument. One possibility is this animal, the apple maggot fly, which diverged from a hawthorn maggot fly. They are considered the same species still. They can interbreed in the lab and produce fertile offspring. But in the wild, they are almost completely separate. The apple maggot flies lay their eggs on apples. The hawthorn maggot flies lay their eggs on hawthorn, which is a native tree to North America. Apples were introduced to North America from Europe. So in areas where apples were introduced, these flies were able to switch from hawthorn to apple. So that would seem an obvious definition of sympatric speciation, but they're not separate species yet. And also in the life of a fly, how big is a population, right? Like what's the same physical space in the life of a fly is one of the things you have to think about. There's still an argument going on about this. Okay. Plants, however, can probably, almost definitely, do instantaneous sympatric speciation through polyploidy, and that's because plants can do something really weird called self-fertilization. Yes, they can make themselves pregnant, only the females, obviously. But if an egg or a sperm has not done meiosis correctly and has the wrong number of chromosomes, and self-fertilizes or fertilizes with another one that has the right number of chromosomes, or they both have the wrong number of chromosomes, then you end up with a new individual with a different number of chromosomes that can't interbreed with the parent species. Voila, you have an instantaneous new species. And we're pretty sure this happens. So yes, sympatric speciation for plants, maybe sympatric speciation for animals. Allopatric speciation definitely is the most common way that speciation happens, and that's where two things are separated physically. So patria means fatherland. So sympatria with its meaning in the same, allo meaning other, so other physical space. So here we have the Mexican spotted owl and the northern spotted owl, and you can see that their ranges shown in yellow there are really, really different. And there is the Sierra Nevada mountain range here separating the two of those. Now, it takes quite a while for a mountain range to be created. So this is a really, really slow separation. Other things that have happened are or groups of organisms being separated or united by the movement of continents. So really, really slow things. Now, allopatric speciation can happen in two different ways. Dispersal is where members of a population move to a new geographic location. So birds getting to an island, or, it could even be owls from one of these groups flying and making it to another area and, laying eggs there and reproducing there. That could be what happened here. Usually you end up with one population in the new place that has a smaller gene pool because that founder group, that founder event, started with a small number of individuals. Now, vicarians is where some natural situation physically separates the two. So the growth of a mountain range, the creation of one continent out of two, or the separation of continents, any of those things could cause this. We do know that about 5 million years ago, the North American, South American, and Caribbean plates all ran into each other. Previous to that, North and South America had been physically separate with a waterway in between them. That collision of those continental plates raised up the Isthmus of Panama, creating a physical connection between North and South America and separating the Pacific Ocean from what is we now call the Gulf of Mexico. That separated populations of sea animals on either side of that physical barrier. So that is an example of vicarians. Now, dispersal events, remember that's where a small group makes it to a new location. They can often lead to something that we call an adaptive radiation. And that is where multiple new species diverge fairly quickly. Now, we're talking fairly quickly in evolutionary time. So this could be in thousands of years, okay? We're not talking like tens of years. Although with the apple maggot fly, we are talking hundreds of years. Okay. And so what happens is an organism goes to a new environment, is able to live and reproduce there, and there is some niche, meaning an environment or a food source or something that is unutilized or underutilized, and they're able to take advantage of that. So there have been several of these. One is the Galapagos finches, and another is these birds in Hawaii called honey creepers. Most of these are nectar eaters. You can see nectars or insects, and this one with this really big bill also eats bird eggs of other birds, obviously not its own. And so what happened was this one founder species made its way to the Hawaiian Islands, was able to establish a population there, and then diverged to new niches or new ways of living, different food sources, different environments or habitats within the islands, and diverged into all of these other really cool honey creeper species. And this would have happened as the birds made their way to other islands in that Hawaiian island chain. And we know that that happened fairly quickly on an evolutionary scale. So that's an adaptive radiation. Okay, so that's what a species is and what speciation is. Next, we're going to talk about different forms of reproductive isolation and how those create separate species.